Voter ID will supposedly destroy democracy. This is the statement that always comes up whenever voter ID is brought into question, and now it's being brought up in England as well. England is basically falling into the same conversational trap that America fell into when they started suggesting voter ID in particular states, where the argument against it always turns into, but this will destroy democracy. This will somehow, in some way, affect people's ability to vote, and you could make the argument that it might affect some people's ability to vote, but I will raise the counterpoint that you would have to be exceptionally lazy or exceptionally stupid to fall into the category of somebody who will be negatively affected by this, as I will cover as we go a little bit further. What's your thoughts on voter ID to start off with?
It's complicated. So, of course, we want a democracy where the vast majority of people participate in voting for our leaders. And that's an issue we have at the moment because most people don't vote. But we also need to make sure elections are open and fair, because what we don't want to happen is someone's elected into office and the losers then don't give consent to the winner because they think fraud's happened. So there is a line we need to tread there between open and fair elections, but also encouraging as many people as possible to vote.
All right, because I think that there are legitimate reasons, given the state of migration within the country, why there is a need for voter ID and a need to prevent fraud that may not have existed before when we lived in a more homogenous and high-trust society. But it does seem that some of these measures are being put into places that historically in the UK haven't been as much of a problem for fraud. There are issues with fraud historically in the UK elections, but the voter ID isn't targeting those areas. So I'll get into that as we go on. So first, we do have a recent symposium that I was part of that's now up on the website where Stelios and I were talking about the politics of Aristotle. And please feel free to sign up to the website and give this one a watch because this was a really interesting discussion. This is the first time that I've read Aristotle's Politics. I've still not finished it, but I got through most of the book that was required for these conversations. Stelios did guide me through quite a bit because this is the fourth time, I think he said, reading this book. It's dense. It's a dense text with a lot in it, and Aristotle as well, because of the nature of the texts that we're examining. They're thousands of years old. They were discovered. We don't know exactly the purpose of them, whether they were a written treatise that he was doing, whether they were lecture notes, whether they were something else, and as such it's a bit contradictory in places, and we don't know the order the books should properly be, and there's debate on all of it. So it makes it an exceptionally difficult piece to discuss, but I still found it to be a very rewarding discussion. So if
I read it many years ago in ancient Greek.
Oh, really?
You get a better feeling for it if you read it in
bet
the Greek.
you do. I bet you do. I can't...
I barely speak English, no man reading Greek.
But if you're interested in that, please feel free to watch it and sign up to the website. So, this is an article from the Telegraph just explaining the types of ID that are required to vote in the 2023 local elections in May. And this is something that is new to the UK, as it points out in the article. This is the first time that we've ever had to do anything like this. Before this, it was basically you go in, you give your name and your address, and then you're able to vote, which is something that's pretty standard for England and places across the UK, because traditionally we live in small communities, everybody knows each other, and you can just walk in, you know the person who's taking the count of the registry, you just give them your name and address, and it sorts out. But this has been something that's been put forward after a report by Sir Eric Pickles in 2016, who was the former community secretary, which warned that there was a risk of significant abuse of the electoral system if people could vote under false pretenses with little risk of detection. And some people thought that this would be that you could just give somebody else's name and address and just go in and vote on behalf of them, or some of the issues that have been brought up back in 2014 that we'll go on to later on as we go through this segment, is that some people have said that you could potentially just go from place to place, from voting station to voting station, giving the same name and address or giving different people's names and addresses and voting multiple times, therefore committing fraud on their behalf or just on your own behalf. But I'll go through the rest of this. So photographic ID will be needed from this date forwards. So that's the May 4th, and the elections are taking place on May 5th. And to take part in the UK parliamentary by-elections and recall petitions, as well as police and crime commissioner votes in England and Wales. The mandate will then apply to UK general elections from October 2023. There will be no requirements to produce photographic ID to vote in local or devolved parliamentary elections in either Scotland or Wales. So this is something that's only going to be applying to England. And like I said, before, electors needed to only verbally confirm the name and address in order to cast a ballot. So they do, if you go through this article, John, if you scroll down a bit for us, please, they've just got a big old list of all the different types of voter ID or just general ID that you can use to prove who you are. There's also something else that they've introduced, which is going to be a voter authority certificate, which is it's free to apply for. You can just go online or call up your local council and just get that sent out to you, which is perfect, which is completely free. Excuse me. And but the other thing that they mention in here is whether these new rules apply to postal votes, which is where some of the actual fraud issues in the past will have come from. And they say, no, you don't need to have any form of photographic ID to vote by post. So there are concerns that have been brought up by people that where fraud has actually happened in the past, this isn't addressing this issue. This might just make it a bit more difficult for some people to go out and vote in person. But one of the things that they bring up in here is that a lot of people who are being critical of this aren't bringing up that, this isn't actually addressing fraud in the places that it should be. It's actually just it's going to make it more difficult for certain people to have their say, including disabled, transgender, non-binary voters, black and ethnic minority groups as well. And once again, if all of those people are unable to fill out a form to be able to get voter ID for free from the government, I believe the time for being able to do that right now has passed, but for all new elections from that point onwards, you can just apply, get your voter ID the one time, and then you can just go and do that. But if you're unable to do that as part of those, I think you're insulting the intelligence of those groups, to be perfectly honest. Of course, The Guardian's first article discussing this was, will the strict with that gigantic list of different forms of voter ID, but its strict new voter ID laws damage democracy. Once again, this is just the talking point that we see trotted out every single time when this has been brought up in America. This will impact disparate communities' ability to vote. They say in here, young and marginalised people who are the least likely to back the Tories will be the most likely to struggle with these new rules, which is, once again, a bit of an insult to these people's intelligence.
Who hasn't got ID in 21st century UK? I would argue you couldn't live here without ID. If you're younger, how do you buy alcohol? Go to a pub, you need a passport to get in those places or to buy alcohol, to claim benefits, to do almost anything you need ID. To open a bank account, it's not the issue they're saying it is. And there's probably two reasons why they're arguing against it. The first reason is everything's racist. So let's not look into it, but everything's racist. And the other point is there's a section of population who will just moan and attack anything. So this new law comes out, we're going to attack it regardless of what it does, what it says, if it has any benefits. We're attacking it anyway. I
think there is a reason that the left wing would want to criticise this, and it does relate to migratory populations that have come to the UK recently. But I do agree with you that in the UK these days, how are you able to do anything if you're at the age of being able to vote in the first place? How are you able to do anything without already having an ID? At least get a provisional license. Provisional licenses are easy to apply for. You might want to learn to drive, or just anything. You can just get any form of ID and you're able to go out and buy alcohol or something like that. Especially if you're going to be turning just 18, you'll probably need ID to buy alcohol, which is one of the first things that lots of 18-year-olds do in the first place. So it is very strange that they trot this out, but I don't think it's that unusual when you start to dig into some of the details of why the left wing might want to criticise this. But there is some other opposition which is coming from this man David Davis, who speaks in Parliament about this and brings up the point where he says he thinks it's bad for our democracy. He doesn't really explain why, other than just the typical, it's just bad for democracy. Why? Because it is that line of argument. But he does point out that this isn't actually, as I've mentioned, targeting the problem with postal vote fraud, which has happened in the past in the UK, which is a decent enough point. But John responded to this with this decent point, which is the capacity to apply for a free voter ID is a litmus test for your aptitude in evaluating the democratic future of the nation. Basically, nice point there, John, which is just if you're unable to apply for an ID in the first place, maybe you don't have the capacity to be determining who should be running the country. But once again, there's an insult to people's intelligence if you think that they can't do that.
Last year I went to the Tories Levelling Up conference in Doncaster, I believe it was, and you had to take your passport to get in.
Well, there you go. I mean, this is just a pretty normal thing. I've had to show ID to be able to get into clubs. Yeah. I've had to show ID to be able to buy all sorts of things. I've had to show ID once so that I could buy a Monster energy drink for my missus. Right. And that's just how it is. That's just how it goes. So if you're not able to buy a Monster energy drink, you're not able to vote.
Yeah.
That's the new rules now.
I mean, there is a point. We do need to be careful that we're not putting barriers in front of people to stop them voting or to make it difficult for them to be voting. So any laws like this do need to be examined and looked at to make sure, and it needs evaluating after these local elections to see what the outcome was. So I'm all for looking at this, but I don't foresee a problem.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't see how this could negatively affect people's ability to vote. Anybody who, once again, wouldn't already have an ID in the first place. So how are they surviving in the country in the first place? But I think the main reason why people are concerned about how this will affect people's impact to vote is going to be the fact that there are quite a number of people in this country who shouldn't be here in the first place, who, if they're able to just go into any sort of voter office and just vote right then and there by giving somebody's name and address, doesn't have to be their own, then this will impact their ability to commit fraud in the local elections, and therefore potentially impact Labour's ability to get votes, even though a lot of the polls that have been taken are tending recently to go towards Labour in the first place. So if they're claiming that voter fraud isn't, if they're claiming that this is going to deny people the ability to vote and then Labour end up winning in the next election anyway, fingers crossed they don't, but if they do, are they still going to be throwing up the fraud argument? Are they still going to be throwing up the destroy democracy argument? No, of course they won't. But this is from 2007, this article, and I do have to point out, I got this article and the next one from watching a recent Scrump and Evelyn stream, so thank you to those two people, because that was a very interesting one, and I found this information very interesting. But if you read this is all the way from 2007, so we can assume that things have gotten worse since then. And this is talking about the amount of people who are in the country who are just not registered. You can take the census, but the census will only get you so far. The census will only be able to get you so much information. So the most recent census they were working off here was 2001's, which I think showed that we had about 59 million people in the country. And even at this point, we had information showing that it might have been closer to about 77 million people in the country, which was even more than the 2011 census, which said about 63, 64 million people. And the information that we got that off was it was based on what we eat, where one big supermarket chain reckoned that there were around 80 million people living in the UK based on the demand for food. And we got that information because they were privately lobbying the Competition Commission to let it grow its market share. The argument, reasonably enough, they say here, was that the market was far bigger than the regulator realised, because the regulator just goes off the census information. So expanding their network was fair. And the article, because it's the Independent, of course, says that, but if they were to reveal this true information, little Englanders and xenophobes would come out in force about the evils of migration, all because of the fact that there's over 20 million extra people in this country than there should be. That just means that the problem is little Englanders and xenophobes.
Yeah, you also need to take the supermarket data, and it's also questionable because they're gaining out of that.
Well, they would be gaining out of that potentially, but there's other information we can cross-reference it with as well in this next article from The Guardian from 2010, once again before the 2011 census, where they were talking about the ability of people to vote. So this is impacting people's ability to vote, where they're talking about sewage data from Thames Water, which it was showing that the amount of sewage that we see being sewage outflow shows a greater idea of who's actually living in a particular area. And they said that in places like Slough, there was about 30,000 more people than were officially registered to vote. And they say Bagley feared consensus takers would have little time to check the estimated 3,500 houses in multiple occupation or the estimated 2,500 living in unregistered sheds in gardens illegally let out, unlikely to return forms in the 56 languages that they speak. So the main point that they're pointing out here is the Guardian is saying, yes, we've got, if we cross-reference it with the Independent article, we can say that there's different areas, different data points, which are suggesting that there are far more people in this country than there should be.
Yeah.
Certainly based on what the census gives, that we've got far less in the census than what all of the rest of the information that we can collect tells us. And they're saying that the main problem with that is not that there are illegal people living in the country who shouldn't be and taking up resources, burdening infrastructure or anything like that. This Guardian article is going, but they won't be able to partake in elections, which is just an absurd point to take from this, as far as I'm concerned. And then there's other information, which Callum sent me this. If you scroll up, we've got this woman here, Kim Johnson, MP, who is an MP for Liverpool, a borough of Liverpool, who puts out a check that you have the right ID, voter ID to vote. You can apply for your voter authority certificate, but then also writes it down in Arabic as well. And Callum points out how strange this is, that she decided that it was relevant to be able to point it out in to write it out in Arabic, given that he checked into this information and said that only 3% of your constituency is Arab, even fewer will only be able to read Arab, and even fewer will be citizens. So why are you writing this in Arabic? And I'm not going to imply negative intentions on her part. It is just very interesting that the official information that we've got seems to point to there would be no necessity to do this in the first place.
She obviously thinks those other people in her area, she wants them to vote for her. And she's, even though there's only 3%, she must foresee them being important in her race.
I suppose if she wants to be accommodating to them and show that she's somebody who's worth voting for, like you say, that would be that would certainly be a way to do it.
But again, we should never be doing public messages in other languages.
No, I certainly don't think so, because we're England and we should be doing it in English because we're English people. But let's look at examples of actual UK voter fraud which have occurred in the past, and none of them, for the most part, seem to actually point towards in-person voter fraud at the places that you can go to vote. They all seem to point towards, like I mentioned, this postal voter fraud.
I'm sure there is voter fraud at polling stations, but it's so difficult to ramp up those numbers to make a real difference, I would imagine. It's postal voting where the mass fraud looks like it's happening. It's postal vote.
I can understand there definitely can be fraud that happens in person. I think in the most recent elections that happened before this one, it was mentioned that there were 33 cases that were brought to court. That's still quite slim, but those are the ones that are brought to court, so you never know if there's more than that going on. But certainly the postal fraud seems to be where the actual difference is made. This is back from 2005, where a former Labour councillor was jailed for election fraud. So it says, former Labour Party councillor was jailed for 3 years and 7 months yesterday for rigging postal votes in a local council election. Mohammed Hussein, 61 years old, arranged for the collection of blank ballot papers posted to homes in the ward where he was standing in Blackburn in Lancashire. Campaigners went house to house asking voters to hand over blank ballots, telling them, "Don't worry, we'll take care of them." And police contacted a number of postal voters and discovered that Hussein's supporters had collected these blank ballots and the declaration of identity form, and then filled in the forms, selecting the Labour candidate and signing it as a witness. All in all, the officers found 233 fraudulent votes cast for Hussein, and that was enough to put him over. And they found out this because there was an irregularly high return of postal votes from Hussein's ward, which was about 9% higher than in the other ward. So they were like, what's going on here then? And it turned out to be fraud. And if we go to the next one, this is a Wikipedia article about Earlham v Rahman, where something very similar happened. There was a lot of information going on where there was voter fraud in the postal votes. The next one, this is it's quite a funny one actually. The court red-handed, caught literally in the act, where Warehouse was an electoral fraud factory, where 3 Labour candidates from the Aston ward in Birmingham, 2005 again, were caught red-handed carrying out postal voting fraud by altering ballot papers or filling in blank papers they had collected from householders. Corrupt postmen had handed over the sacks of postal ballots to Labour candidates. Little boys had been paid to steal postal ballots from letterboxes, and bags full of postal votes had arrived late at the count to be included without question in the poll. And supposedly this was going on in broad daylight, in public, where people could see. There were just people walking around with wheelbarrows full of postal votes, just walking down the street, just going to wherever this was, and the police ended up finding them just in the act of filling in their own filling in their own ballots, voting themselves into office, essentially. So it's interesting that we're going for the avenue of attack where we're making it more difficult, slightly more difficult, to vote in person, just by having the ID that just shows your name and address, which is pretty simple enough, but you can say that that's making it slightly more difficult. Whereas the actual issues with voter fraud in the past seems to have come entirely from the postal area. And there is word from 2014, like I mentioned earlier, where this person, John Hemming, said, an MP for Birmingham, said that there is probably still voter fraud going on, and he pointed out that you can go from polling station to polling station. An individual could vote 20 times like this, and he said he was checking the details at the time of 10 people who never voted but were down as having voted. So it's important to keep this sort of to look these things up, because voter fraud is a thing that can happen. It's a very important thing that can happen because it impacts the outcome of elections, and especially when you do have potentially a much larger population in England than we do have down on record, it's very important to be able to keep track of what's going on. Like you say, I think it's important to keep these things fair and keep it open so that you're not putting unnecessary barriers, but at the same time, when we're living in the situation that we do at the moment, I think it's important to be able to keep a good hand on what's going on with the elections. And like you say, we'll see how much this impacts after these local elections. We'll see how much it impacts after the next general elections as well.
Yeah, I mean, for our system to work, like I said before, you have to have the consent of the loser. And if you lose your election and you think there's been fraud, you're not going to give your consent. Our whole system will collapse. It has to be open and fair. And postal votes, I mean, yeah.
There's way too much room for issues.
And maybe they've
those.
started with the ballot centres first, and maybe if this works, maybe they'll put that out to the postal votes, because you'd imagine the complaint about postal vote ID would be you're picking on disabled people. That would be the call to them. Only disabled people you're
There'll always be
on.
some marginalised group that they'll point to,
They
saying
will,
that this impacts them too much.
But if they do it to the ballot stations first, it affects everybody, and then you can say all we're doing now is leveling the playing field. We're now going to put it on postal votes. There's far too many postal votes. Postal votes used to be you're bedridden and you can't physically get to a polling station, you can have a postal vote. Now it's, I'm too lazy to walk to the ballot place. I want a postal vote. Anyone can apply for one now. It's abused.
It certainly seems to be from those previous examples. So perhaps it does need to be more the postal votes that need to be clamped down on. Perhaps you're right that they're doing this as maybe a trial for the postal votes in the future, but we'll see what happens.
And then we need to look at the cultural element of this. We call it fraud, we call it criminality. But the countries where these individuals have come from, mainly Pakistan, Bangladesh, it's not fraud or criminality there. This is called what we do to win an election. So they're doing what they do to win the election in the game of politics. And this is what they've done in their own countries. And they've just imported that practice here.
Well, certainly given the names of some of the people who were caught previously running for Labour, Mohammed Hussein, it seems to be...
Yeah.
Interesting that it's those sorts of people who are caught doing it in the past. But once again, we'll see what happens with this. If you haven't managed to get your voter ID ready, if you don't already have an ID for these local elections, I suppose you're a bit late. But if you're watching this, I imagine you have some form of ID, so you'll be able to vote anyway. So let us know how you get down on how you go down at the polls.
We hope you enjoyed that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed, you can go and get the full podcast for free on our website. And also you can pay us as little as £5 a month to get access to all of our premium content, such as the Contemplation series, this episode where Josh discusses with Stelios whether or not cities are having an impact on our psychology and politics. If you want to find out all of the content that we're putting out, you can follow us at lotuseaters_com on Twitter and Getter. Until next time, goodbye.